Right. Waiting room's off. Well, welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, help host this event. I see some familiar faces in the crowd. My name is Jacob. It's a pleasure to be here. I am a Terra Learning for Action alum myself. I went through the program back in October of last year, Okapi cohort. I'm now based out of Chicago, Illinois, where I help support a nonprofit on zero-emission bus transportation, both in grant writing and project management capacity. I help consult with a few early stage companies and am involved in building some community platforms out here in Chicago. Pleasure to be back in a community ambassador capacity here today and host this event with Sharon. Before I introduce our today's speaker, just a little bit of housekeeping. As this fills up, we had a large number of RSVPs, so I'm going to try to encourage folks to use the Q&A function if you have any questions that come up during the event. If it remains a smaller group, then I might invite folks to come up live and ask their questions directly as it makes sense. But start with the Q&A. I'll monitor that throughout and read out at the end. With that, though, it's my pleasure to introduce Sharon, who is an energy strategist, board leader, and advisor with more than 3 decades of experience navigating the intersection of business, regulation, and climate policy. Sharon currently serves as chair of the Board of Trustees at Unity Environmental University and as audit and risk chair for Community Health Options, a $200 million health insurer. Sharon also advises Halcyon, an emerging AI platform designed to make complex public energy data and regulatory information easily accessible. Previously, Sharon led the North American Power Advisory Service at IHS Energy, now S&P Global, and served as chair of the Maine Public Utilities Commission, where she oversaw major electric transmission and renewable energy cases and helped launch the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. She began her career as an intelligence analyst with the CIA and a duty officer in the White House Situation Room. She holds an MBA from Wharton and a BS in Applied Earth Sciences from Stanford. Sharon, it's a pleasure. Thank you for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
All right. Well, thank you, Jacob, for that intro. And hello, everyone. Appreciate you having me today. And I just finished the Teredo Sea Turtles cohort group, so it's been really great to be involved with this community. So today I want to talk to you about a story that's about something that happened in the climate change space that really wasn't supposed to happen, and it wasn't supposed to work, but it did. And I think that matters now more than ever as we face what is likely to be the biggest surge in electricity demand in the U.S. that we've seen in decades. And as you can see, in my role as the former PUC, Public Utilities Commission chairman in Maine, I was a founding member of RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. And so that's the story I want to point to you today, and then talk a bit about some of the parallels that I see as we look forward. So I want to take you back like 20 years, really. So 2005, there were 7 Northeast state representatives sitting around a table trying to do something that really no one else had done yet in America, and that was to create a mandatory carbon emission trading program. The federal government, this was in the Bush administration, had walked away from the Kyoto Protocol just a couple years before. California was still a few years away from passing AB 32, which changed the climate space in California. But I remember sitting in those negotiation rooms, and what was apparent was that everyone thought we were going to fail. So the utilities and consumer groups were genuinely worried about rate increases, and I think that's absolutely fair. There were coal and other fossil fuel-fired power plant owners that were threatening to close or to relocate outside of the region. We had governors from different political parties trying to find common ground, and certainly the environmental groups thought we weren't going far enough. And on the other hand, the industry thought we were going too far. So really, everyone thought, and I think had a good reason for why they thought it wouldn't work. There would be legal challenges. There was a suggestion that if we put a carbon trading program in place in the Northeast, the plants that were located there would move to another region, and in fact, just move across the border to Pennsylvania, because Pennsylvania was not and still is not one of the RGGI states. So, and probably the biggest concern of all was that price increases on electric bills would mean that the consumers would revolt and would not accept a carbon trading program. But as you know, the thing is we couldn't afford to do nothing. The science is clear, even 20 years ago. And many of our constituents wanted climate action. And so somebody had to go first. And so after several years of sort of staff level negotiations, the heads of each of the state's respective departments of environmental protection and the Public Utilities Commissions got together. And in fact, we got together in the old Rockefeller estate, which is this palatial home on the Hudson River north of New York City. And it was really a testament to what that estate, what early success in the oil industry got the Rockefeller family. And so J.D. Rockefeller's heirs have since turned that over to their foundation and have used it to help support nonprofits, particularly in the environmental space. And so that was the site where we had negotiations for really the first U.S. multi-state carbon cap and trade program. And so maybe I should just, for those of you who are not familiar with RGGI, and it's RGGI, pronounced RGGI, it's now up to 10 states in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic in the U.S. And it's essentially a cap and trade program. So it covers power plants in these states. So each of those states or the operators must buy an allowance for every ton of carbon dioxide they emit. And RGGI holds quarterly auctions to establish the price. And what's probably most important, the total amount of emissions in the region, that cap has to go down over time. And that's what forces the price of carbon to go up, and it's what removes carbon emissions from the region. But there's a critical design feature that made it politically viable, and that is that the auction revenue that is raised every quarter doesn't just disappear or go back into general funds. It primarily goes back to electric ratepayers through energy efficiency programs, through bill assistance, and through renewable energy investments. So the result, as you can see, is really significant. There was significantly big cut in the carbon emissions, by some estimates, at least half since it launched. At least $6 billion have been returned to consumer benefits. Some analysts suggest perhaps more than that. And the electricity rates in the RGGI states, in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic, are comparable, in some cases lower than neighboring states that chose not to participate. It also survived many legal challenges. It survived political opposition. There was a 2008 financial crisis and cheap natural gas that flooded the power market in the U.S. that nearly broke this system in 2012. I can talk a little bit about that. But I think why all this matters is because RGGI proved something, is that you can design climate policy that delivers environmental results and economic benefits, but only if you design it on purpose and hopefully get it right. So I want to talk about kind of three hard truths that I think came out of my RGGI experience and how that might apply today, because I think one of the biggest issues we are now facing today is the new demand for electric power in the U.S., driven primarily by data centers and AI. So the first hard truth is that you cannot wish away economic fears. You really have to design around them. That was true then for RGGI. It's certainly true today. So back then in 2005, when we were designing RGGI, the predictions were really quite dire. There were industry models that showed that there would be rate increases of 20%, 30%. I saw one estimate that was even 50% in certain scenarios by putting a price on carbon. We also heard that manufacturing plants would definitely close or relocate to another state. And so those jobs would go away, which then, obviously freaked out all the policymakers, all the governors and state legislators, and even governors in the Democratic states that had been elected on a clean green mandate were under pressure to walk away from RGGI. And to be fair, those fears are not irrational. They were based on legitimate concerns about competitiveness, about cost. So, so here's what we did. So first of all, we redistributed the auction revenue. So other than some minor administrative costs to support the RGGI organization itself, every dollar that was raised by the carbon emission allowance in those auctions went back to consumers. And primarily through energy efficiency programs, in some case, direct bill rebates and investment in various clean technologies. So some people did see slightly higher energy costs, but many people saw lower total bills because they were using less energy. Second, there were safety valves, and we spent several years trying to design those with the help of economists. So we built in price floors and ceilings so that the market couldn't go crazy in either direction. And really importantly, businesses could then plan with certainty. Because one thing I learned as a commissioner at a public utilities regulatory agency is that businesses may not like high prices, but the thing that they hate more is uncertainty. So if at least if you know what the ceiling is, they can make plans for that. Third, we phased in RGGI gradually. So there was no shock therapy. Plants and their plant owners had plenty of time to comply. They could fuel switch, they could buy allowances, they could become more efficient. And allowances were reconciled over a 3-year period to allow flexibility to the power plant operators. And so, as I said, the result was at least $6 billion in consumer benefits, emissions cut in half, and the regional electricity rates stayed roughly competitive. And so I think the lesson for me is that you don't dismiss the economic concerns. Instead, you design a program that addresses them explicitly. So environmental policy became an economic development tool, essentially, for these states. And so it was only fairly recently that I started thinking about how the lessons I learned in forming RGGI 20 years ago really applies today to the AI boom that we're seeing now, because I hear a lot of the same arguments. And to be fair, these are significant concerns because data centers can consume as much as 500 megawatts, for example, which is about the size of a mid-sized city. I mean, that's significant. Utilities are telling regulators across the country that they're going to need billions, that's with a B, grid upgrades. I mean, these are very expensive upgrades that are going to be needed to support this rollout of new data centers and to support AI. So the question that everyone is asking right now is, who's going to pay for this? Do we spread those costs across all ratepayers? Do we make the tech companies foot the entire bill? Do we let them jump the queue? Because there's an interconnection queue to connect to the transmission grid. And do we allow them to just jump the queue because they have deeper pockets than everyone else? And remember, and particularly for those of you who've gone through the pterodactyl class, you know that we are simultaneously trying to electrify everything else, transportation, adding heat pumps, electrify industrial processes, all these things we need to do for our climate goals. But nobody wants to see their electricity bills double. We were expecting electricity bills to probably go up gradually because of the electrification of the economy, and hopefully you spend less then on things like gas for your car. But bills were going to go up. But now people are talking about really dramatic growth in electricity bills driven by these new AI building plans. So and again, this is really exactly the same tension that we faced with RGGI. And I suppose the difference now is the sort of the speed and the scale, because we're not just talking about a region of the U.S., we're really talking about all of the U.S. And so I think the lessons are that you need to design the consumer benefits from day one. So if we are going to build massive new power infrastructure to serve data centers, then there needs to be a clear answer to the question of what's in it for everybody else. So maybe it's energy efficiency programs funded by the data centers. Maybe it's new distributed energy resources that are brought on across the different points of the grid to improve resilience for everyone. Maybe it's economic development that does create new local jobs. But the one thing I think supporters of this industry are saying is like, just trust us, it'll work out. I don't find that good enough, and I think Reggie, the program design around Reggie, taught us that it doesn't have to be. So a second hard truth that I think we've come to is that stakeholder resistance isn't noise that you ignore. It's data that you need to listen to. And so when we formed the Reggie program, as I said, the opposition came from everywhere. And fair enough. So coal and natural gas fired power plant operators said that they would just close. The industrial customers worried about their own competitiveness. And some states did pull out, even after we launched. And New Jersey was an example that left early on. Um, and, I think it's fair to say that some of the opposition might have just been for opposition's sake. There are people who simply don't support, climate initiatives. But I think a lot of the opposition was around the legitimate concern of designing the program and trying to address some of those real design flaws. So, for example, a fossil fuel fired, like a coal plant, we're concerned about the stranded costs. They had assets that they'd spent millions of dollars to create that, under the assumption that they would be able to operate for a few decades. And so that concern, led to build in as much sort of compliance flexibility as we could. So those carbon allowances were allowed to be banked. You could borrow them. There was multi-year compliance periods. So it really did make the program stronger. During this time, there was a lot of concern about leakage, and essentially leakage is the opportunity for carbon prices to make bills in certain states higher, and the neighboring states would not go up because there was no carbon price on their power, and so that was the so-called leakage problem. And industrial customers particularly were concerned about leakage, so that businesses would simply move to the states where there was no carbon pricing. This was an issue that we worked on for years before the first auction went live, because we wanted to make sure that there were substantial energy efficiency investments for industrial processes, so not just small business and residential customers, to try and address some of the real competitiveness concerns about making those industrial customers as efficient as possible. And there were, as I said, many states that were skeptical, even the ones that were in the room negotiating. And so they pushed on things like monitoring and transparency. And I think that was really important, that we built what was at the time, I think, the most robust MRV system. That's monitoring, reporting, and verification system, really, of any carbon market at that time. And these were public auctions. There were quarterly reports after every auction. There was an independent third-party monitor that watched all of it and made regular audits of the program itself, so that people felt that the process was fair and transparent. And so I think one of the things I learned from that experience was that when stakeholders raise concerns, sometimes they're pointing to something that will actually break the program. And so trying to fix those issues doesn't weaken your policy, it really strengthens it. And the stakeholders that we didn't listen to, I mean, some of them were right, and we paid the price, because in the first few years after the auctions were launched, by 2012, the price of the carbon emissions collapsed, in part because we had not adjusted the cap appropriately when demand fell after the recession. So there was less electricity being sold, but we had based the cap on historical output. And so essentially the Reggie auction pricing collapsed to the floor. And so obviously not effective and not what we had hoped for. And I'll be honest, I thought there were times that there were certain opponents that were just being obstructionist just for political reasons. But looking back, I think many of the concerns were certainly legitimate. And so I think that's where kind of the art of policy comes into play, is how do you distinguish between this is actually a design flaw of our program and this is just something you don't want to do at all. It's hard to tell the difference sometimes, but I think listening to the stakeholders really matters. And so when I look at where we are with the AI boom now, I mean, again, I see a lot of very similar statements being made. So today's stakeholders, for example, the tech companies are basically saying that the current approval process are way too slow, and I would say they're not wrong. The interconnection queue to put new large loads onto transmission systems across all the states is backed up for years at this point. And that's a real problem. Uh, and I would say, I hear a lot of climate advocates are saying, this demand is unacceptable, and in particular, they want no new gas plants. It's just and I think that's fair. They're pointing to a very real risk that we lock in decades more new fossil-fired infrastructure, just as we're trying to decarbonize the U.S. market. So that is certainly a legitimate concern. And as we've heard, local communities where these data centers are being sited have raised very significant concerns about water use, about land impacts, noise, inappropriate zoning. These aren't just, NIMBYisms. These are environmental justice issues. And I think it's important that we recognize that, because if a data center spends, or uses millions of gallons of water in a drought-prone area, particularly, that's a problem. And if it runs on temporary permits, as we've seen in one plant that allowed oil-fired power peaking plants. These are plants that really are not only supposed to be used for like 100 hours a year, being run 24/7 for a year while the sort of regulation gets sorted out. That's a problem. And so I do feel sympathy for the current commissioners at state utility commissions around the country, because they are being told simultaneously that they need to ensure reliability, they need to keep rates affordable, we need to decarbonize the grid, we need to approve these data centers as fast as possible, and we need to sort of maintain grid stability and fairness. And there's no clear framework right now about how to balance all that. And so I do think that, to my point, each of these objections carry certain pieces of information about what's going to break if we continue, without really coming up with a design system that works. Because are we creating new reliability risks? I think that's a fair question. Are we being equitable about who benefits and who bears the costs? And are the planning processes adequate for this pace of change? So again, I would say the lesson I learned from Reggie is don't dismiss this as just noise. These are the signals that suggest that the existing situation is perhaps untenable and that some new policy framework needs work. And so, because if nothing else, not only in Reggie, but as a Public Utilities Commissioner, the one thing I've learned is that ignoring stakeholders doesn't make them go away. It just guarantees that your policy is going to fail. So I think that's an important point I wanted to make. All right, I've got maybe one more hard truth, and then I'll try and wrap it up for questions. So I still advocate markets. I do think markets work, but you have to have the right guardrails. And so, when we were looking at creating a carbon emissions, allowance program, trading program back 20 years ago for Reggie, we chose the cap and trade program over a carbon tax for very practical political reasons. It was more viable in the region for policymakers and for the public to accept a cap and trade program than a carbon tax. But the key design feature was that we did have a hard cap on emissions. So that lowering that cap over time. So we would force carbon out of the system. But we do it in a way that was flexible, that allowed different plant operators to decide how they were going to comply. And so, there was a serious infrastructure that had to be built around the RGGI trading program, because there were, continuous emissions monitoring systems that had to be in place. The quarterly auctions, were a big event. Took a fair amount of activity to make sure that those were, done transparently and on time. There was a lot of regional coordination among the 10 states because I will point out something that is perhaps not obvious to everyone, and certainly people who are not in the US may not appreciate this, is that there's no regional compact process in the US. We have states and we have the federal government. But when regions try and act together, particularly when they have different leadership, this is very hard to accomplish because there's no governance mechanism for that. So the way that RGGI worked is that each state had to pass identical rules or legislation, truly identical, no word changes, because that's the only way that carbon emissions and carbon allowances could be traded across state lines. And so that was a lot harder than it sounds. I'll just point that out. But the carbon credits had to be fungible, otherwise there's no regional program. But in starting in 2009 when it was launched and lasting at least to 2012, we learned what happened when the guardrails aren't strong enough. Because as I said, after the 2008 recession hit, and along with that, fracking drove down the cost of natural gas. So natural gas plants were displacing coal for economic reasons. And so the RGGI allowance prices collapsed, down to the floor, so less than $2 a ton at that point. And that was really too low to drive any meaningful change, to be fair. So I think early opponents of RGGI would point out that RGGI failed in its first few years. And if by failure you mean we didn't have a mechanism that set the carbon price high enough to make a real difference in terms of people's behavior, then yes, they were right. So what the RGGI board of directors and staff did, and then in conjunction with their state policymakers, is they adjusted the cap, went back and tightened it, and we restored essentially market discipline. And I think that experience certainly taught everyone involved in RGGI that the market rules, need to be adjusted. They need to be there, but you have to have the ability to make significant revisions because it's really hard to predict the future. And the future really, rarely matches your forecast. So the cap, couldn't just be theoretical. It really had to bite. The monitoring has to be airtight, and the regional cooperation and coordination was not optional. It was essential for the whole thing to work. So when I look at how we're thinking about the AI boom now, I think there's a lot of questions about, whether the market system can sort of keep up, because we are now looking at, suggestions that perhaps electricity demand may grow by 10 to 20% in the US. Everyone's stepping back and saying, oh my God, that is a lot of load growth very quickly. And so what we're seeing now is tech companies are striking, essentially guaranteed power deals. And these are bilateral contracts, absolutely legal, but they're bypassing the market in doing that. Some other data center operators are talking about building their own generation and microgrids and just bypassing the central grid entirely. And I think on one level that does make sense. They need reliability. But it does raise huge questions because, what ensures grid system reliability? And who pays for the grid infrastructure? And does this undermine the current power supply market mechanisms that we have spent decades building in the US? So, and of course, as we all know, from going through TerraDo, we are trying to integrate massive amounts of renewables for a very important reason to address climate change. But we have to do so in a way that maintains reliability of the system. And so the old model, the one that I grew up with when I started in the energy sector more than 35 years ago as a utility supply planner, was that you had dispatchable fossil fuel plants or you had nuclear plants running 24/7. That provided the base load, and then you just had some peaking plants to cover when the demand went up, like at 5 o'clock in the afternoon when everyone was, turning on their ovens and their lights and all. But much more challenging now, obviously, when renewables like wind and solar are your marginal unit. We obviously are making strides with battery storage. I mean, there's a lot that is improving, but I would just say that the interdependencies of the power system now, particularly in the US, is much more complex than what it was before. And this is happening, I'm sad to realize it's at a point when regional coordination is really breaking down. We are seeing states starting to compete against each other to attract data center deals, offering tax breaks and cheap power, expedited approvals. The regional transmission organizations like PJM is under attack now by all the governors for all the states that it serves. I mean, this is sort of the opposite of the kind of collective action that we probably need at this point. And because, market flexibility is great, but you need strong coordination and really, hard constraints. And I think we're possibly in danger of losing both of those. So, I mean, if I were designing, the AI era electricity policy, if I were electricity czar now, I mean, I'd start to ask with, what is the hard constraint? Is it emissions? Is it reliability? Is it affordability? And you can't optimize for everything, but you need to have, understand what your priorities are and then put guardrails to protect against the failure of each of those. Let's see, how am I doing on time? Pretty good. Okay. Well, let me go to like just some takeaways because of the challenges of today are pretty significant. So, as I said, it really only occurred to me fairly recently that some of the lessons I learned in RGGI are very much applicable today. So, first of all, design for the buy-in of the different stakeholders from the first day going forward, because consumer benefits don't just happen as a happy accident. They have to be built into the structure of whatever system that you've designed. And I think RGGI worked then, it still works today because people saw tangible benefits. They saw lower bills from efficiency, there's obviously cleaner air, there was actually progress in carbon emissions, and there was economic development. And so if you can't answer that question of what is in it for the consumers, then I think the policy is in trouble. And I think policymakers won't support it. Secondly, definitely treat the stakeholder feedback as a design feature. When industry, environmentalists, and communities are all raising concerns, they're probably pointing to something that's very real. And so the art is in distinguishing between this absolutely has to be fixed and you just don't like this policy. And I think good faith engagement across different stakeholders will make the policy stronger. And then third is to build it right. And I think this is the tension that we're living with now is that, RGGI took, sadly, almost 6 years from the initial discussions to the launch of the first auction to create that carbon allowance program. And I don't think we have the luxury of 6 years now. The AI demand growth is already happening, and the projections for the next few years are kind of off the scale. But that doesn't mean that you skip the hard work. I think good design matters. Bad policy implemented quickly is probably worse than no policy, in my view. So I think the stakes are really high now. But I do think that we proved something important with the RGGI experience is that you can design policies that balance environmental and economic goals. I think you can build coalitions that cross political divides. I think that is still possible. And I think you can create markets that work. So the question is whether we as a society, as analysts, as consumers, can we apply those lessons or will we repeat the mistakes from the past? I think that remains to be seen. But I'll just end on a very positive note. I mean, I think we succeeded with RGGI because again, I cannot tell you how loud the naysayers were 20 years ago that like there will never be a regional carbon allowance trading program in the US, period. But yet there is, and it still is here and still creating benefits to consumers and is still bringing the amount of carbon in these regions down. So I think we do need to do it again, probably need to do it faster and think bigger. But I think that's where the hard work of good design among stakeholders really comes into play. So with that, Jacob, I think I'll stop talking and happy to take questions or hear comments or whatever we like at this point.
Right on. Well, thank you so much, Sharon. That was fascinating. I've got plenty of questions spinning in my own head. Don't see any listed in the Q&A here, but I'll cede the floor to the crowd. I see some hands raised already and see with the audience, but thank you again. Jeff, do you want to come off mute and kick us off?
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks for that, Sharon. Super fascinating topic for right now. This is crazy what's happening. So we see the tech companies have just massive amount of profits. These are the richest companies on the planet right now. Like, what are the downsides of us saying to them, if you want this reliable energy, you guys have to build the grid for us?
Yeah, well, I don't, there probably are some downsides because partly the reason all this works is because we're all in this together and that, um, we have shared responsibilities for reliability and for build out. But I would say that, that's where I see the trend going is that the data centers themselves, the owners are going to pay for all the upgrades themselves. And as a public utilities commissioner, ex-commissioner, I would find that fair because we often, we spend a lot of time in rate cases and in other legal proceedings trying to figure out cost causation. And it's not always as easy as you think. So even putting a data center on the grid is not always, you can't always say then that all the upgrades are needed because of that one data center. And there's the complexity of the sort of shared cost model that we have in the US in most states. But that said, I do think that's where we're going. Obviously, these are the companies with the deepest pockets, and they are the ones that want to move fastest. So I do think it's fair that they pay for the upgrades. What I'm a little more concerned about is we've just seen action, particularly like in the last week, from the DOE and the FERC on the US side to allow data centers to jump the queue. And so that these transmission queues, they're set up, they're very complex, but they're very transparent, and it's sort of a first come, first serve. And so there have been other project developers sitting in the queue waiting to, build whatever they're going to build for years. And so the idea that the data center operators will be allowed to jump the queue, I find somewhat problematic. And that's an issue that's going to be, I think, addressed over this coming year. But
Yeah.
we'll see.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because I don't see a huge public demand for these data centers. It's not like everybody I know is like, "Oh my God, I can't wait for more data centers and more AI and like more computing power." It's not, that's very much coming from the supply is being just pushed, on people. I mean, I think people like using it, but nobody is like, it doesn't seem like it's a huge demand, kind of a thing in demand right now, but people are using it because it's there.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. And I think what's really interesting is where the projection goes in terms of like how much more AI use will, invade society and like to what extent
Yeah.
do we really need all these data centers? Maybe we do need them all. I do think some of the projections are a little crazy though. I mean, if you're watching some of the analyst projections about just how much more electricity these AI centers are going to use, they're sort of, at least some of the studies I've looked at are basically assuming that every data center that's in the queue now is going to get built. And that's ridiculous because a lot of projects that are in the queue never get built, but they're holding their place because they might be developed. So but is a very uncertain future. But I do think the underlying point is, in terms of if all these reliability upgrades are really necessary, then data centers should pay very much their fair share.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jeff. Andre, do you want to ask yours?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, I have a question. I'm actually researching data centers and data center companies for a business sustainability class, and I'm also taking parallel to this fellowship, but I think the question applies here too. One of the questions I had, and I've been looking at some data center companies, builders that seem to be kind of leaders in the sustainability space, and they're saying, oh, we use so much renewable energy, our power use efficiency is such, our water use efficiency is such. And what I haven't been able to suss out is there a larger kind of movement within the data center industry to set some sort of minimum sustainability standards or to have a larger effort to kind of raise the floor for everybody? Or is this just a couple of companies going out there and saying, hey, we're really great, and kind of leaving everything else to be a race to the bottom? That's what I haven't been able to get a handle on. I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure I have the answer yet. I'm looking at the same set of issues, though, to be fair. And so I think the sort of hyperscalers, so the really big ones, the Metas and Googles and OpenAI, those guys, I think are genuinely committed to clean energy. And they've made quite a few specific commitments in regard to data centers as well as their activities more broadly. And we're seeing some early partnerships right now to help develop some of the clean energy in conjunction with specific data centers. So I think that's sort of the good news, but at the same time, it really is kind of the Wild West out there. And like it seems like there's a new data center developer announcing themselves every day, and because it really is, there's gold in our hills. So we're seeing that. And yeah, I don't what I have not seen is a overall industry commitment to saying, oh, by the way, let's try and minimize the amount of new fossil build that we create. I don't see that from kind of like the sort of average small scale data center developer operator. I think the one thing that is interesting is, and it opens up a whole new can of worms, but nuclear is now back in vogue, and so depending on whether you think if you believe strongly in climate change, then nuclear really does have to play a role, even despite its environmental issues. And we're seeing, I've never seen so much investment as I have in the last year or two in just, small modular reactors, and some of these partnerships, where, millions, hundreds of millions of dollars are now flowing to these nuclear startups, in some cases, some of the more established large vendors to jumpstart the nuclear industry. And I think, but again, that's not near term. I mean, the earliest I've seen any of the sort of SMRs, small modular reactors, maybe 2030. And even that I think is probably optimistic, because I've been waiting my entire professional career for new nuclear to, safe, reliable new nuclear to be developed, and we're still waiting. And of course, along with fusion, which is kind of the gold standard, and I don't know, maybe the better metaphor, pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. It's like everyone wants fusion, because fusion actually would solve many, many problems, and obviously much safer, and and if it were deployable, in a commercially viable way, we really could displace a lot of other base load. But again, we're still very far away from that. And I'd say the only encouraging thing I see about the data center development is we now actually are seeing money going into the fusion companies as well. And again, from these very rich companies that they may not be making a lot of revenue yet, but they've got a huge amount of investment dollars, and they're spreading those investment dollars around on the energy side. And so, if something happens there, I mean, I'd be delighted. But again, it doesn't really solve the problem of what's going to happen in the next few years as electricity demand goes up, as these data centers continue to come online.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe it'll be a little bit like Tesla, and this will force the rest of the industry to kind of invest in some new things. And I think one take I've seen on this is there is some concern that basically these hyperscalers will buy up all the available renewable energy out there, and other companies that want also access to renewable energy are just going to get locked out of the market or priced out of the market, because Google and Meta and Amazon are going to come in and buy everything up.
Yeah, I've heard that too. Of course, the pseudo-economist in me then says, great, because that means there's demand and more renewables will be built. I hope that's true. Obviously we're in a very challenging time in the US with, the federal rollback of the IRA and other support at the federal level for renewables. But I do think overall it's a good thing when demand for renewables goes up for whatever reason.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andre. I do have two questions here that I would like to get to, but this discussion on nuclear segues really well to a comment Eder dropped in the chat. Summarizing quickly, related to this nuclear, do you see some of the obstacle more technically related or politically in terms of integrating nuclear to our energy base?
Uh, well, probably both. Uh, I mean, conventional nuclear, so large nuclear plants. I mean, the two new ones that have been built in the U.S. in Georgia and South Carolina were, political and economic disasters. One is up and running or partially running, but billions of dollars were wasted. And in some cases, ratepayers are still on the hook. So that the nuclear industry has not done itself any favors, using the conventional approach. Whether the, smaller nuclear reactors, can actually be deployed at scale. I think there's still technical issues to be resolved, but also the commercial viability. I'm still a little dubious. I mean, I'm hope I'm wrong, but I haven't, some of the studies I've looked at, the costs are still very high. And so, frankly, we would need a carbon price that would really support, that's much higher, certainly than what RGGI provides, but even nationally, I don't know if we'll ever get to that point, but that's, either that or just really strong national policy. And we see that, in other countries. China is not backing away from all forms of renewables and nuclear. And so, we'll see if China wins the race on that and makes those commercially viable. But I think it's a fair question I think, for now, there are multiple obstacles to really seeing the nuclear industry in the US succeed.
Thank you. Cassie has asked, curious what you think about the opportunity presented by the movement toward bioregions, regions defined by the geographic and ecological systems rather than political boundaries. And I'd probably tack onto that. I see conversations around restructuring energy grids around watersheds just to ensure that the application. So any comments or thoughts there?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, it's challenging because a lot of how the electricity system in the US is structured is, based on 100 years of history. So there are, franchise agreements, all your basic transmission distribution utilities, particularly the investor-owned ones. Well, actually, even municipal and co-ops, have a franchise under some sort of state authority. So to redraw those maps would be pretty profound. And then even the regional transmission organizations, which are collections of these utilities to deploy power across a regional space, are more defined politically than sort of from an environmental perspective. I don't know. That's a really cool question though. That's one I will ponder, but I have not seen it really reach the levels of the kind of people that I interact with, which are utility planners and RTO executives and state legislators. It's really not an issue that I've seen come up yet.
Interesting. Thank you. A question here from Jane. Do you think we should have a federal cap and trade program for the AI boom?
Yes, but I just don't know how we'd get one. And hearkening back to RGGI, one of the things I heard so often, it wanted to make me tear my hair out, is like, well, we're never going to have to really launch RGGI, even though we're doing all these years of planning and figuring out how the auctions will work and all this, because the federal government will be too ashamed by the fact that a group of states has moved forward and that the federal government will go ahead and adopt a national cap and trade. It's like, well, that didn't work. I don't think you could have shamed the Bush administration, and it certainly didn't. And obviously we've had any number of administrations since where I think that argument is even weaker. And it does take tremendous political will. And what's really weird is that, the cap and trade program is a Republican idea. I mean, because it started essentially, with Massachusetts, which was at that point run by Mitt Romney as governor. It was a Republican idea. And to be fair, it worked successfully in other types of pollutants. So we have a NOx and a SOx auction, cap and trade program essentially for non-carbon pollutants in the US that, worked very well and was, supported, bipartisan, way. But today, I think we're in a very different spot. And so even Republican ideas of a market mechanism, to the extent that it involves trying to limit the emissions of carbon, I think, is a non-starter for now. And I'm very disappointed to have to say that.
Jeff, go ahead.
Yeah, I think the water is a really big concern too, right? If we're pumping fresh water out of our aquifers, which is a very, very slow renewable resource, do you know if there are, for these data centers, are they working on ways to cool them or use recycled water, or just to get like a certain amount of water and not continually draw on fresh groundwater? That's because that seems like it's a real losing proposition for everyone.
Yeah, and they're very aware of that. And so I do work with any number of sort of developers or the companies behind the developers. They're aware of both the water and the energy issue, and they're working extremely hard on both. And one of the things I love about being in the energy sector is that there's all these technical problems, and we have these equally brilliant engineers and scientists working on these issues all the time. So one of the things I'm happy about is that we've already seen the efficiency curve of, the GPUs and, the data centers, essentially using less energy per square foot or per compute than we saw before. And I think that trend's going to continue. So I'm a little happier that some of the really outrageous forecasts about how much demand growth there will be, I think, are not accounting for the fact that there's energy efficiency gains. But likewise, there is a lot of brain power, being put toward the water question. And we're seeing, obviously, liquid cooling is now very much, different non-water based liquid cooling. And just because it's become a stakeholder issue, a very legitimate concern about the use of water, particularly in drought-prone areas where some of these data centers are going, that is an issue that is being addressed. Now whether it's fully solvable, I don't know, but I think the good news is that from a technical perspective, there is a lot of attention around trying to reduce the amount of water cooling that is necessary for these data centers.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you all. Andre, I see one more question in the chat, but I know, Sharon, you have a hard stop at the top of the hour. So maybe I first hand you some closing remarks, and then I could probably pass this question along, or if anybody else has follow-ups, might settle this after the call.
Yeah, no, and I'm happy to answer questions later. And again, sorry, I have to hop off very soon. But yeah, I would just say, drawing the threads together again, trying to design for the multiple stakeholder concerns, I think just has to happen. Can't be the afterthought and just kind of hope for the best. I think in particular, to Jeff's opening question, the consumer benefits have to be tangible. They have to be visible. And to the extent that these data centers are being developed now, they have to be immediate. So I think we'll see that. I do think regional coordination, we cannot allow it to break down. I think we have to see, it's harder than it looks for sure, as I learned in Reggie, but I think it's essential because we can't have states playing against each other at this point. I think that's just going to be disastrous. And certainly the timeline matters. We had kind of years to work on Reggie, although, in retrospect, we should have done it 10 years before that because climate change was real even 30 years ago. But, the AI demand is here now. And I think the fact that we were successful with Reggie does give me some hope that we can address these very complicated issues head on. And we just need to think bigger, move faster, and I think together we can solve these problems.
Thanks so much. A nice optimistic note to end on. Sharon, thank you so much again for sharing your time with us today. I appreciate you all joining today's call. Have a great rest of your afternoons, mornings, evenings, wherever you find yourselves, and look forward to the next one. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Jacob.
Yeah.
Bye now.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.